Hello, I'm Charles Epstein. This is the X Factor podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Today we're going to take a trip across the pond and visit with Michael Borrelli, a director at AI and Partners who joins us from his HQ in London, England, to discuss the EU AI Act, its implications for AI across Europe, and its implications for U.S. companies doing business there. Quick background before bringing Michael on. AI and Partners is Europe's leading professional services firm for firms subject to the EU AI Act. Michael brings to this work 10 plus years of experience in financial services, compliance, and technology to help clients navigate the complex and evolving regulatory landscape of AI. This includes a strong passion for responsible AI and its potential to create positive social impact while minimizing its risks and challenges. Michael, hello.
Great to see you, Charles, and happy Friday. It's good to be on the show.
Yes, and you're closer to your weekend than I am to mine, but can't think of a better way to slide right into this weekend and have this conversation, Michael. So thanks so much.
Neither can I, and it's a landmark week as well. Maybe your listeners will want to hear something about that.
We always want to hear breaking and dramatic news, so please go right ahead. I was going to say, I know we're speaking on Friday, as you mentioned. Yesterday, there was a big piece of news, which I'm assuming is, to some extent, what you're alluding to.
Phenomenally big. So it follows the EU Act entering into force last month, and this week marked the signing of the world's first treaty or convention on AI. So the European Commission signed on behalf of the Council, and various signatory countries have effectively agreed and signed to it, including the United States of America and the United Kingdom. And what happens is the actual provisions of the treaty, which are very similar, almost word for word to the EU AI Act, will be implemented via the EU AI Act. So if you think about that logically, and I was in preparation for our podcast today, I was thinking about this, it effectively means that the EU AI Act applies to US and UK companies, which is pretty interesting.
Interesting. We're going to get into that, and that's a really layered situation, obviously, with UK breaking out of the European Union. Seems kind of interesting, if not kind of contradictory. I wonder what this public sentiment for this act is, for their being a signatory to it.
I think we're going to see this in the coming weeks. I think Matt Clifford is due to produce the national AI strategy, and I suspect that'll be in the next 2 weeks or so. But in terms of the positioning, it is very, I think the stars are aligning in various ways for AI governance. You have all these different instruments, but the endorsement for the EU AI Act is clear because it's seen as the major piece of legislation to implement the treaty. And this comes at a time when there is global convergence on the use of technology. And again, trying to take a 30,000 foot view, the adoption challenges are there and various bottlenecks are appearing, and regulatory change is being cited, as it always is, as a blocker. But I think this could really help relieve that pressure and allow us to move to that next stage.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting because there is so many pieces of legislation floating around. These two pieces you mentioned, obviously in California here, SB 1047. It's almost like there's this big regulatory AI soup that's bubbling, and we're going to have to see what emerges from this AI regulatory soup in the coming months and years. And obviously we just have to some extent just remain vigilant. And, hope that we can get out in front of it in a sensible way. I don't know about you, but here in the United States, I'm not sure that I'd entrust our legislators to be sensible about this. I think they're very, very behind the curve on technology generally. They've been behind the curve with some aspects of the internet and social media, and I would expect this, but, it remains to be seen. But surely this is going to require cooperation globally. It's clearly a global issue.
I couldn't agree more. To your point about this pace of innovation, that is a key thing, because we're at the embryonic stages and we want it to continue to grow and support the innovations which are probably happening right now and in the future. And the legislation is designed to keep pace or be in sync with the evolving changes. With respect to the global development, global risks,
Yeah.
attached, those need to be managed accordingly. And it's, you get various, heavyweights in the industry, such as Fei Li from Stanford, Andrew Ng, and, various, so it's even A16Z are providing some, insight into the risks of AI. It is, if we don't get a grasp on this, it's ultimately going to sort of stop global innovation. And yes, you do get the arguments regulation stifles innovation, but I would flip that and say regulation stifles untrustworthy innovation. However, regulation supports trustworthy innovation. In practical terms, I mean, if any product on the market that is not trustworthy and doesn't comply with the regulatory requirements, then that is not the type of innovation that will be probably there in the long term.
Yeah. By the way, Michael, it occurs to me we violated the first law of stagecraft, which is, of course, to say that you have to build to these things. And we just started right off and we went thermonuclear right out of the gate. But yeah, I do want to get back to some of these things, the EU, AI, what happened today. And again, some of the implications, as you alluded to, for U.S. companies who are doing business in Europe. But let me back up a little bit, get into your background. Most importantly, I noticed when I was scanning your LinkedIn page that you have a background in tennis. And we really didn't touch on this in a previous conversation we had. I mean, as a tennis player myself, I know not to ask you how good a tennis player you were at the height of your powers. So I'm just going to ask you, how serious a player and do you play to this day?
I'm good enough to lose with dignity and have a little smile on my face and enjoy it at the same time. I haven't played for a couple of years because I've been really sort of deep down in understanding the regulatory requirements and understanding how, the trials and tribulations of running a business with my business partner. Big fan of it though. Big believer in sport being a metaphor for life. And one of the critical things that sport teaches us and ultimately will allow humanity to interact with AI moving forward is the resilience piece. Mental resilience, emotional resilience, physical resilience, spiritual resilience, all of that stuff in this AI age is going to be critical, because where a lot of and forgive me if I'm going into this, please do stop me.
No, please.
Where a lot of let's say, routine jobs, which we're used to and carry a lot of value, both socially and economically, are going to be taken by AI. We're going to have more resilience in knowing how to reconstruct ourselves and interact in this new space. And ultimately, that's what the regulation's there to safeguard, and ensure that the innovation happens at a sustainable pace.
Yeah.
So yeah, long-winded way of saying love sport, but the resilience piece is phenomenally important.
Yeah. Well, before we move completely away from tennis and AI, I do want to say that I'm waiting for that AI tool that figures out exactly where I could improve about 5 to 10% of my game, particularly with my forehand. Anyway, more seriously, Michael, you began your career in the financial sector, then moved into financial compliance, including a stint with a crypto compliance consultancy before co-founding AI and Partners in 2021. What put you on a compliance path and what led you to AI and Partners?
Compliance path is, to be honest, the first profession I went into. I started off in the front office at Barclays, but it didn't really suit my skill set at the time. And I sort of fell into compliance and met an amazing mentor, a man who's a heavyweight of the compliance world and I believe is doing very well to this day. And he sort of took me under his wing and learned the fundamentals of compliance. But the best piece about that is you're at the intersection between the lawyers there to protect the firm and the front office, the commercial guys winning the business, managing the client relationships and driving the revenue forward. So you have to have an understanding of both the law and how it's applied practically, but also how to interact with the front office. And I think that the best compliance officers and people definitely I learned from and have had the pleasure of being around do that balance or manage that balance extremely well. AI Partners, I met my business partner, Sean, over 4 years ago. So he's the founder and CEO of AI Partners, ex-tech accountant, and he managed a lot of the work for the GDPR implementation, as well as an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. So when he brought this idea to me and said, look, we need to start building, we've both been doing this full time, I was captivated because it was always a chance to be part of a new regulation and build a product around it. And yes, the risk back then was pretty high. You're building for something which may or may not materialize, and you're going through the legislative process and the uptake of AI and all the, should we say, global geopolitical developments have happened there, but that's always a given. And yeah, that's how I got involved and been working with the team, and it's probably been an amazing journey. Some would call it an action-adventure film, which carries its own stresses and challenges, but
Sure.
it's very rewarding, and I wouldn't be having conversations with people like yourself if I wasn't on this journey.
Are there certain types of organizations you consult and work with, and how do you ensure their compliant use of AI?
So it depends which side of the business you're talking about. So the software side is mainly for the professional services firms, so lawyers, accountants, consultants, whereas the training course we have and the consultancy advisory piece is more for the large enterprises, but also for SMEs and scale ups. So we predominantly a compliance software company, but we also have regulatory and compliance advisory services. So it depends on what the need is. The team is lucky to be working with some very high caliber firms, everyone from IBM, who's a publicly listed partner, to leading law firms. But prior to it entering into force, we've done a lot of work for companies to get our brand out there, and we're now recognized globally as one of the leading firms. And we hope to be announcing making an announcement on the September the 30th. So keep this in your diary of our association with the AI Pact in some capacity. So please do stay tuned for some announcement around that date, because the team have worked extremely hard to build up the reputation as a leading professional services firm to be able to cover all those aspects.
Well, that's exciting news, Michael. Yeah, definitely keep us apprised when that happens. Definitely like to talk with you about that and share that with our listeners and people who are part of the AIX community. For our listeners who are unfamiliar with the EU AI Act, if you would provide us with an overview of its regulatory framework, we'll then get into the particulars and its implications for U.S. businesses doing business in Europe.
Cool. So it's a very complex piece of legislation, but the best way to think of it is a risk-based approach to the regulation of AI systems with a human-centric approach. So what that means is the way the AI systems are regulated is based on the risk level, and the risk in this context is the risk of harm to an individual's health, safety, and fundamental rights. So that's the human-centric part. The risk of harm is meant in the sense of economic, social, physical, physiological harm, and it's making sure that any interaction with an AI system, any use of an AI system, because it's context and use-based, reflects that. And here's the interesting part. So the extent of the regulation or the applicability depends on the risk level. So you have 4 levels: unacceptable, high, minimal, and limited. And the actual level of the AI system determines the regulatory requirements that apply. The majority of these apply to high-risk systems. Those could include anything from AI embedded in a teddy bear to AI systems using national critical infrastructure, or for, should we say, border control or workplace management. So quite literally AI-enabled CCTV in a workplace to those. And then the other risk levels, you have unacceptable, which are those that are prohibited. And again, timing is crucial. By 2nd of February next year, they have to be phased out. So they can't be in use. And then you have the you have the minimal and limited categories, which cover general purpose AI models and basic chatbots and things like this. But the definition of AI is what it all boils down to. And the legal definition covers everything that's automatic decision making based on data. So any algorithm, any model, any AI system is now subject to the regulation would have to be inventoried and risk classified pretty much
Yeah.
before that first deadline.
You kind of touch on this question I was going to next ask, but before I get to that, I'm curious, are there penalties assigned based on where you are in the so-called delivery chain? So for instance, if you're a developer, if you're a reseller, if you're a user, does it specify who this covers? And if so, the extent to which each one would be penalized if their model crosses into one of these risk areas?
Great question. Yes, and to be confirmed. So the to be confirmed bit is the liability part, and the liability is being covered in a different legal instrument called the AI Liability Directive, which is being worked on. The work had already started, and I believe it's being picked up this month. But with respect to the AI value chain, everyone across the value chain has an accountability. So of the six, you have providers, deployers, authorized representatives, distributors, importers, and product manufacturers. And each one of them would have an obligation. The main people or the main types of people in scope are the providers of AI systems. So people like OpenAI for ChatGPT and their deployer. So any company deploying or using an AI system would meet that category. What is also interesting is you also have any third parties assisting a provider or an authorized representative would also be within scope. And a third party provider could be someone like NVIDIA supplying hardware or chips to a provider of AI systems. So it's to basically make sure that everyone across the value chain takes some form of accountability and responsibility to make sure things work as they should, and make sure that the risk of harm is minimized or doesn't exist. So it's gonna take some work for people to make sure they know what they're doing and making sure that trustworthy AI systems are put on the market.
Yeah, no, for sure. As you know, the Act calls for transparency in conducting risk assessments, in designing systems with ethical considerations in mind. The question, of course, becomes, how will this be monitored and enforced? And to enforcement, what are the penalties for noncompliance?
So the enforcement piece is being talked about quite frequently at the moment, and it's going to be similar to GDPR. So you had the regulation itself is directly applicable in all EU member states or 27 EU states. And the national competent authorities will be nominated. So specific AI bodies or regulators will be developed. We are seeing a trend at the moment of these responsibilities being allocated or assigned to data protection because there is a strong crossover between data and AI. So it is with some degree of certainty, the data protection authorities will be responsible, but this will differ on a country by country basis. Spain will be different to France and to Italy and Germany and so forth. The penalties again depend on what so the penalties are, I believe, under.
Excuse me, Michael, I'm curious. Again, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but how much discretion do each country that signed on to this have with respect to some of these issues to the application and enforcement of these penalties?
Well, application and regulation is mandatory, and enforcement will be at the discretion. However, the enforcement authorities will be ultimately accountable to the AI office, which is the division or arm of the European Commission responsible for monitoring the EU AI Act and providing guidance, and they are all members of what's called the European Artificial Intelligence Board. So this is a pan-European new governance body responsible for this, and they have authorities. There's one member from each member state part of this, also the AI office and the European Data Protection Board and European Data Protection Supervisor. So we're talking a whole new infrastructure, and I'm going to the weeds because you kind of prompted me to do so.
Yes.
A whole new compliance infrastructure is being set up for this regulation in the same way for GDPR. So we really are at the embryonic stages of a completely new ecosystem.
Yeah. As you know, SB 1047, the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act, got to come up with some air after that. That's being proposed to regulate AI across the state of California. It's highly controversial, with major AI and tech figures taking pro and con stances. The issue, broadly speaking, turns on whether it gets the balance between innovation and risk right. In your view, does the EU AI Act get the balance right?
Well, you're asking a compliance person, inherently. I would say yes. I would say that we don't yet understand the risks fully, and it's better to be safe than sorry. So it's better to have the most rigid standards enforced, and then if we need to change them as we go, and maybe be more pragmatic in terms of application, so be it. But let's start off strong and see the lay of the land as we go along. I think to do it reverse would be more difficult to change if we need to do it, and it could be subject to various external forces that could prevent that from happening. So I think it is very important to bear that in mind. Also, that these risks are so nascent and embryonic. We don't need some of the smartest people on the planet and are undergoing daily research on this. People are doing PhD thesis on these, and this is a constantly evolving field. So I think any potential accusation of this being overly draconian, I would probably disagree with them.
Question: what is KYAI, Know Your AI Systems, and how can firms comply with the KYAI requirements?
So KYAI is a concept come up with the team at AI Partners, and it refers to KY, Know Your AI System. And it derives from the fact that it's a risk-based regulation. So if you think of financial crime regulation is risk-based. So how you treat a client depends on their risk level. So if you want to open a bank account, with the nature of your background, the products you offer, the channels you're in, geographies you're in, will determine your risk profile, and it's risk-based. So when you're assigned a risk classification, the way you're treated depends on that risk level. And the same thing applies with an AI system. You do assessment of an AI system to assign a risk category, and that determines how you treat it. So if it's unacceptable high, specific transparency, or limited. Now, how we envisage the KYI process being implemented at AI Partners is two very simple processes, at least in description. You identify how many systems you have, and then you self-assess them to get a risk classification, because then you can take that next step. So we're at the stage now where companies don't know how many systems they have and need to know what to do based on the risk level. So by having the software and the means to do so allows them to get that inventory, get those classified, and then take the next step.
Michael, why do U.S. businesses need to know about the EU AI Act?
Because it's like GDPR. It's an extraterritorial regulation and affects any third country firm. So any US firm with a EU presence, footprint, or nexus would have to comply. It's seen in a similar vein as the GDPR in terms of its range and severity, and we see US companies taking this very seriously. We've spoken with various US-based lawyers who are looking into this. We've done some research into how US companies will be affected, and we hope to release that later this year, if not early next for sure. And we're actually releasing a white paper, which you very kindly contributed to, next Tuesday, examining this very issue. So, the third country element is critical, and I would strongly urge people to start taking this seriously, because the first deadline is not long to go.
Yeah. By the way, I'm going to give you another opportunity to plug that paper. So, just give me a moment. I promise to do that. Let me ask this, what is your personal view of the risks posed by AI? I touched on earlier in this conversation the ability for legislators on both sides of the pond to understand at a sufficiently deep level to create responsible legislation. I'm not so sure on this side that we have that in place, or at least it's going to be in place anytime soon. So what's your view, apart from the legislative piece, what's your view, the existential risks of AI? We touched on this a little bit, but I just want to get you on the record, Michael.
My view is that every risk should be identified and mapped, no matter if it's its severity. And I think with AI, these risks are going to evolve every day. So today you could identify a risk and assign a level and have it mapped. And it's very likely that could change the next day because of the use of technology or the certain updates, as functions, features, and other aspects. So I think it's something which it's risk reassessment. It's not a very static. The whole concept of risk needs to change. It's a mindset thing. It's not, okay, we've done this. We need to look at it once a month, once a year, etc. It's a dynamic
Yes.
real time approach in the same way that your mind is constantly thinking and it's a whole new way of conceptualizing risk. So I'm going to probably not give you an answer to that question in terms of being very analog, but what I will say is these risks are dynamic, constantly changing, and require a very different mindset and culture to navigate. And that is probably, humans are very resilient and we're very adaptive and we're very good at coming together and solving problems. This is a very big cultural transformation, and in terms of the way we think, it's going to have to change.
Yeah, no, sure. Which leads me to the last question, the aforementioned report that's coming out on Tuesday. And you thanked me for my contribution. Well, first of all, thank you for giving me a sneak preview of it. It's really terrific work, very timely. I'm going to give you a chance to just maybe, if you would, give us a succinct overview. Coincidentally, this podcast is going to be dropped on that very day. So there will be a link. People who are listening to this, you look in the description, you will have a link to the report. I recommend you go out and grab it. And the last thing I'll say before I give you an opportunity to just describe it. And anything else you're working on, Michael, happy to hear about it. But you had welcomed me to provide a quote. Again, thanks so much for it. And really went, to this idea that this is all changing so rapidly that it's really going to require constant vigilance, because AI is everywhere felt, but nowhere seen. But it's this ubiquitous thing, and we just have to keep an eye on it. And it travels in so many different ways. AI does. In any case, I've said my piece. Yeah, tell me and our listeners, if you would, a little bit more about this report that's coming out.
So we like to do white papers quite frequently, sometimes monthly, sometimes quarterly, sometimes semi-annually. We look at various different aspects. The third country piece is something which has come up frequently. I mean, one of the main questions we get quite literally on a daily basis is, how does it affect the UK? Because of Brexit, it's outside. We're a third country. Why do we need to care? So I thought, okay, address the points that people are concerned about. So this extraterritorial aspect is under Article 2 is what I chose to focus on. And we've leveraged cutting edge research from GDPR, its analogous equivalent, to provide insights on the likely locations of AI systems, the likely approaches that businesses can take, even doing a one-for-one conceptual comparison between GDPR and the EU AI Act. And it's research that we've produced for people to get a better understanding. It's the culmination of over 4 years of extremely dedicated work by the team, interacting across the private and public sectors. And it has also transferred into other aspects of our work, including a training course which we produced, and we're doing a hard launch later this month or early next. And we're also doing various other white papers, one of which I mentioned is focused on the EU versus the US. So stay tuned for that, and definitely look forward to getting you involved in that again, Charles. And one on fundamental rights. Again, it'd be great to have you involved.
Oh, for sure. No, I'd be honored. You guys do fantastic work. Again, thanks so much for sharing that report with me before you get out with it. Again, I encourage everybody to go grab the link, check it out. It's well worth your while. Michael, we mentioned a couple of times in this conversation, but this is all so fluid. I'm going to have you back on a little bit down the road, check back in. I know you said you have some reports that are coming down the pipe, and love to talk about those things. So please, love to have you back.
I'd love to be back. And one final word from me: recommend anyone to listen to this. I think Charles Epstein is a phenomenal practitioner and a great host. And the short time we worked together, it's been phenomenal. So big fan of Charles and his work, and make sure you tune in.
Thank you, Michael. I really do appreciate that. Today, I spoke with Michael Borrelli, a director at AI and Partners. He joined us from his headquarters in London, England. This is Charles Epstein for the X Factor podcast. Thanks for listening.